Sawadee Krap, hello and welcome to another edition of the Victor Black podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about rust-proofing the Iron Warrior. We're going to be talking about longevity for our tribe, and our special guest today is Dr. Scott Stevenson. Now, the reason I've asked Scott to come on the show, quite bluntly, is not to draw on his credential background as a scientist, but rather really I wanted to get his intake and his opinion on this discussion from his practical experience or hands-on experience perspective. I'm not sure how long ago you started training, Scott. I think last time I had you on the show, you said you started training when you were 13 years old. Is that right?
I was 11, so
11.
yeah.
Okay. So how many years is that for you that you've been training with the iron?
I got to give up the math now. It's almost I'll be 50 this year. So
Okay.
yeah, nearly 4 decades.
So
38
nearly
years.
40 years. Okay. Well, I have 34 years. So between us, we've got more than 70 years of experience.
I know. Right.
That's a lot of time. So, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I would say when people ask me, that's just sort of fun. When people ask me like, so how long have you been training? And most of the time I can say, well, let me ask you a question first. How old are you? and I'll say, well, add 10 years to that, or add 15 years to that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of weird to think of it that way, but it gives people perspective that this is as long as, a lot of people will bow out before they've even been training that long.
Absolutely.
People train for their early 20s, late 20s, and they kind of stop. So
well, not only bow out, but I would say forced out as well. Forced out through injury and not through personal choice, but circumstances, as it were.
Many times, yeah.
And this is part of what what motivated me to want to do this conversation was last year in 2019, I competed in the over 50 Mr. Universe in the federation I competed in, and I came sixth. But the truth is that the reason that I came sixth was not because I'm a particularly good bodybuilder. I think I'm a very, very ordinary bodybuilder. It's almost a case of last man standing. Right?
That's exactly how I call it. Yep.
So when I first started competing, I was like down the end of the line, and slowly over the last 30 years, I kind of slowly moved my way up the line because so many people, I would argue the overwhelming majority of people fall off. And I don't know necessarily they fall off because they want to fall off or they lose the passion. I think it's fair to say that some percentage, life happens, family happens, careers happen, and things like that. But I would argue that most people fall off because they end up getting some type of debilitating injury, some sort of catastrophic injury, and it's simply not practical for them to continue. Would you agree that? Would you say that's true in your experience?
Yeah, there's so many. It's a function of attrition. I'll agree with that without a doubt. Sometimes the best, in my case, it's the same thing. The best bodybuilders, they get their pro cards and they no longer compete at the higher level, so they moved on, and then their pro career might end. I think it's going to be a combination too, because if let's say your life has changed, you've gotten married, you've got kids, and then you have some injuries that make it a little bit less fun to train. You're not quite it's not quite as exciting. You're not endeared to the activity as much. You have to reconfigure things. Then it all sort of comes together, and eventually the teeter-totter goes the other direction. You've got kids, other responsibilities. The injuries aren't quite as good. You're feeling old. You're also around. It's also who you keep around you in your immediate circle. The saying is like you're the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with, or something like that.
I do agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. So you're around people who are saying, "Oh, I feel so old." There's a guy at the gym. I'm not sure why he even comes in, to be honest, but he comes in to talk. Actually, very, very nice guy. Say what?
Comes in to complain.
Yeah, he does. He really does. He comes in and every time I've interacted with him, and I know this now, he's kind of on my do not talk list because he'll keep me from getting into my workout, but he has something to say about how old he is and he wishes he were younger. And it's like, no, that's not the right perspective to have. So all those things can kind of combine. It's not always just a devastating injury or it's impossible, but it's just that you just sort of let things pile up on the wrong side of the teeter-totter to get you in to keep doing what you once loved. You have to find a way to fall in love again. I guess is the way I like to put it. Yeah.
So continued motivation is obviously one of the things that I guess we would need to consider in that regard. particularly, and this is ultimately how I ended up, following the enhancement path. I started training as a drug-free athlete. I started competing as a natural, but I literally got to the point whereby progress was so slow that I felt just incredibly frustrated by the time and the effort you put in for a pound a year.
Right.
And I just felt like I'm either going to abandon ship because I didn't feel like I was getting a suitable return for my investment, or I need to cross that threshold and reinvigorate that and restart that process. And so that's literally how I crossed that threshold. I literally spent a good deal of my life being, steroids, enhancement. That's like the devil's poison sort of thing. So it's interesting.
Yes.
So I wanted to, if we could, because I find it interesting when people say I don't have an hour and a half or an hour to listen to a podcast, because quite bluntly, I could talk about the subject probably for 3 days. Like there's so many things you could talk about. And so I thought maybe we could just touch on 3 areas of longevity and talk about some strategic framework, and then talk about some practical day-to-day things that people may not be aware of, even that might help them to just start thinking in different, in a different framework towards. So what do I need to do today as someone who's starting on my journey, or 10 years into my journey, to make sure that I'm the guy that, if I want to be by choice doing this 30, 40, 50 years from now, I have that option available to me. I haven't painted myself into a corner from which there's no return.
Right. And
so,
let me add one thing too, before, and this will intersect with where you're going, I think. And this is something that I picked up from a guy, and we're going to a little bit of the research area here, but it's a very practical, hands-on thing that I found working with clients and people over the years, the average person all the way up to someone we're talking about who has to figure out how to keep falling in love and keep it fresh. There's a guy named Rod Dishman who was renowned for years. He was the foremost expert in exercise adherence. So figuring out what are the predictors of people who will continue to exercise. There's a whole wealth of literature on health behavior. Like, do people take care of themselves? Do they quit?
Okay, my little pup is coming in the door here. That's pretty much watching is my baby pit bull. She's 1 year old tomorrow. So
she just hates you.
Just 1 second.
It's gonna happen to me. Don't worry. Like, it's an authentic podcast with me if my dogs bark or they come by and say hello.
I apologize for that, buddy.
No, it's fine.
Sorry. What was that guy's name? I would like to follow that up.
Rod Dishman. I think Roderick, maybe it just goes by Rod, R-O-D.
Do you recall off the top of your head just 1 or 2 key points from what those factors, what those influences were?
One of the things is a barrier to action. This is in I'm trying to think of the name of the health behavior model. There's people that there's a stages of change model where people are pre-adopters, or pre-contemplators, they're contemplators, and then begin to adopt a behavior. And this can kind of apply too, is like, are you going to continue to adopt the behavior that is now a changing behavior? You're not going to the gym because you want to, let's say, pick up women, or because you got a show to compete in. Now your behavior is now a new one, and you have to figure out where you are in that perspective of adopting the change. And the thing that actually the point I was going to make is you can look at all those various models of health behavior, and a big one is barrier to action. People will often find that a barrier to action is getting from work to the gym, or getting up in the morning and once you're at the gym, you pass that barrier, and then you're fine. You're going to go. Like, you're in the right atmosphere. Everything's ready to roll. But that's a barrier that prevents you from getting there. It's the traffic sucks. It's a 30-minute drive. You're tired. And those things will tend to be perceived by people in different ways. So changing your perception of that can be very, very important. That's one of the big ones. Social support, as we talked about, the average of the 5 people. Spousal support.
Spousal support is a big one, yeah.
Yes, gigantic, as you know. And the thing that I did actually, I have somewhere a conceptual model I put together. I try to combine all these things. This was the beginning of my graduate degree, but I want to sort of get an idea, how can I keep people coming in a way that they enjoy, which is what we're talking about, figuring out how to keep this up. And I was thinking, okay, I'm going to go have a class on exercise psychology with Rod Dishman. I'm going to have the keys to the inner universe here to just figure this out. And it'll be just a snap. I can hypnotize people into going to the gym. And the thing that he gave up on that line of research and started doing animal-based work and more of a biochemical types of things, looking at brain activity during exercise and all that sort of jazz. Because he found that really ultimately, and this is a very important point, I think, it's not something that some people want to admit, but we are creatures of immediate gratification in large part. So for me, I like the training. It's intrinsically valuable. I like to go to the gym. I like the challenge of it. It's something that I want to do regardless. And especially with, for instance, the pandemic now, where things are very different. What your motivation is to go train was exposed in many people. You can't go to the gym. I actually I just ran into someone yesterday who had seen me on Instagram, and I was out in the middle of a field in Illinois filming videos I was stuck there for 2.5 weeks. My truck broke down. I had to get a new engine. I love that. It was a blast.
Yeah,
it was
experience.
Great. Yeah, it was really I wanted to stay, to be honest. There's no gym, but there were posts out there, and I was picking up pipes. I had set my mind, I'm going to deadlift that pipe before I leave. And eventually I did this long, 30-foot long pipe. It probably weighed 400 pounds at the one end. I'm like, I'm going to get that. It was a blast. It was just as kind of primitive as you can get, really, in a modern world. And that didn't bother me at all. It was exciting and fun to do. So back to the creatures of immediate gratification. If you're the sort of the bait on the hook for you at one point in time is a competition, or it's being amongst going to pick up women or the social environment or what have you. And all of a sudden that changes. And now you're the only old guy in the gym and there's only younger people there. You don't get along with those folks as well. You got to figure out something that you enjoy about the actual pursuit, about the actual activity, literally that's really elevates your dopamine levels in your brain, that you're excited about, that's just fun, that you'd go and do. Like no one would say, hey, here's some, you want to have some chocolate cake when you love chocolate cake? Yeah, I'll eat chocolate cake because I just like chocolate cake. It almost needs to be that level of, this is something I want to do right now because it feels good, not because, I know that my grandparents and my parents all had cardiovascular disease. I need to, keep my blood lipids in place, and the exercise is going to be good for me. Those are so far outside of our immediate perspective that's not a motivator for most people. Maybe it was if they had a really salient, they lost their father or their mother, very young age, and I'm not gonna let that happen to me. That could be a motivator, but I think everyone needs to find something if they don't already have it. And I think you probably already have it. It's there.
I haven't, but it's interesting that you even raised the subject, because quite bluntly, I wasn't even this is the fascinating thing about, interacting with other human beings. I wasn't even thinking about motivation as part of this discussion. It's fascinating that it comes straight. It almost comes to the fore, like the first thing out the box sort of thing. And yet I was thinking more from the point of view of so from my point of view, at 53 years old, I think, I have to avoid that catastrophic injury that stops me doing what I love to do. It's almost like I had this in spades, but I'm concerned about that. And
that box is checked. That's not a problem for you.
Correct,
Too much motivation is the problem.
Correct, but for other individuals, it's a very valid point. They how do they sustain that motivation over a multi-year, or a multi-decade time frame? Really, it's a very valid point. I was just my own filters, as it were. So that's very, very interesting. So
but you've probably known people who were high-level competitors who maybe fell off the wagon, so to speak, at some point.
I'll be honest with you. Maybe it was because of I'm going to say this, but then I realize I'm going to say the wrong thing already, but maybe because it was the era I lived in. I grew up when whatever Dorian said was correct. Right. Like this is the era I grew up in. If Dorian did it, then I will do it. And let's segue this. I apologize. I know I'm kind of stealing that conversation.
No, let's
take that there, and that is, in my opinion, during that period of time, with the focus on intensity of training, I think it resulted in a lot of people sustaining injuries they probably didn't need to sustain. And you only have to look at the individuals, with the high profiles that were advocates of very high intensity training. A great many of them you have a very long list of injuries that are consequential to a fabulous way of building tissue mass. I don't think anybody's going to argue with the validity of the training model from a hypertrophy point of view, but it also, I think it's fair to say, is a great many people got hurt doing it.
Yeah.
So most of the people I know that I grew up with and trained and that sort of stuff, they've either torn quads or torn pecs or torn biceps, and this has affected them emotionally. Even they don't like the way they look anymore, so they stop competing, or they find it just too difficult to come back from a double quad tear. Like that's a pretty profound injury. Or alternatively, they've had some sort of health scare through in the overuse and abuse of enhancement practices, and scared the bejesus out of them, and they've kind of sworn off it, as it were, and that's enough. I'll draw a line in the sand and say, look, I can't sustain that over these multi-year timeframes. And I think that's probably, if I was honest, what causes most people to drop off. Because if you were to consider that the typical doses that we see at high level use, you can't sustain that for decades and decades at a time. It's impossible. And so you can understand if you have an individual using 20, 25, 30 milligrams per kilogram of anabolics, you only have a finite window of time before you cannot do that anymore. So I think for me, and my experience at least, it's been more that. It's been, you do that, you get so much time, and then the bill comes to you, and now you have to basically step out. So I guess that's, maybe we could, I wasn't planning on starting that, but since we're there, I think it would be logical to follow on from that. And this is one of the reasons I say that, in my opinion, a great deal of what we are taught today still is the legacy of elite athletes. And so what they did, we should do as recreational trainers. And we tend to kind of, it's almost like I like to use the analogy myself. Some people don't like analogies, but I'm someone that does connect with them. It's like, if you want to pitch for the New York Yankees, you can't worry about blowing out your shoulder. You just have to pitch. And if you blow your shoulder, you blow your shoulder. But if you don't have the skills to ever make it to the big league, and you just love playing baseball, and you play it at a local level, you probably should pull your head in a little bit so that you can play for the next 30 years and enjoy the game, rather than take a point of view that says, look, I'm just going to pitch until my shoulder doesn't work anymore. They're two very different frameworks, and yet, in my opinion at least, this is one of the few sports where we tend not to separate the professional from the amateur enthusiast and say, look, if he's taking 2 grams of testosterone, I need to take 2 grams of testosterone. If he's going to have a 10-year career making money and then retire, I need to understand that I'm never going to make any money out of this, but I also have a 10-year career. And I think people miss that disconnect. So if someone's a professional athlete and they're making an income from this, and they're taking higher levels of risk, and they accept the fact that they have a finite shelf life before those days must come to an end, I'm not convinced that recreational lifters make that connection in their mind, that they will also have a limited number of years at those risk levels before they are forced out of the game.
Right.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, you said a lot there. One, that just simply recognizing that, and within the first couple of years, in the case of bodybuilding, whether you're going to have,
two or 3 years,
Yeah. Unless you're a last man standing type of guy, you might just outlast everybody.
That doesn't count.
Yeah, that doesn't count, right? If I get a pro card now, it's just because no one else showed up.
No one else turned up on the day.
That's the only reason why it would happen.
I agree.
So the thing that I say again is take your perspective, and what is it about the training or the endeavor that you really, really love, and reconnect with that in some way, shape, or form. So some people, it might be that they want to become the biggest, most monstrous, most muscular bodybuilder they possibly could. And then if they tear both quads and the symmetry's lost, they can never get their legs back, then that dream is lost. And if that's completely, that was all of it, which maybe for some people it might be, then that could be the end of the road to some degree. But the thing that I think I have in that Rustproofing the Iron Warrior article on Elite FTS that I make note of is that you can't, if something about that is the nature of the pursuit to try to become the best that you possibly can. For me, I like to get into the gym and fall into that zone where I'm experiencing an altered state of consciousness. which is sort of natural to all of us. Kids like to spin themselves around in chairs, and people jump out of airplanes and do motocross and drive their cars really fast. And you and I, we like to go in the gym, and see if we can find a way to bleed out of an orifice in some way, shape, or form. So you can still have that in some way as long as you're smart about it. And it may not be 600 or 700 pound squats or whatever you did previously, but if you can be honest and say, you know what, I'm not going to do that, but I can find a way, instead of having 10 sets during my workout that are all out and crazy, just a couple sets, and still have that essential aspect of the workout that I love so much, and keep that in my day-to-day when I go into the gym, then you're still getting that immediate gratification, that you're still getting the nibble on the carrot that's dangling in front of you, which keeps you coming. So, and there are ways to do that. And I know you read the whole article. There's some things you can do that are actually brutal, very, very difficult, that are certainly challenging. So if the challenge is what you seek, you just need to find new challenges. And also, if this helps, because really, to some degree, it's a beauty contest. Bodybuilding is. There's much more to it aside from that. But in that regard, you want to look better, bigger, more impressive than other people. And we all are connected that way, unless you've gone through enlightenment and you're just sort of floating around in the lotus position, then you're connected to your ego. And you can also say, look at me in comparison to the other people at my age. And if that is one way to say, you know what, I am still extraordinary and outstanding. I'm not the same as I was when I was at my prime in my late 20s, early 30s, or whenever, but I still am going in. And you can see, even if I'm not loaded up on, 3 grams of anabolics per week, you can see that I've put in years in the gym. I still have an impressive physique relative to everyone else, relative to the average person, probably, unless something really diabolical has happened to you. You can have an impressive physique that will blow people away until your 60s or 70s, and be better than, especially nowadays in the States where we have this epidemic of obesity. You'll be extraordinarily outstanding. And also, if this is an ego thing, or it's just something that just sort of helps you reaffirm who you are in your mind, and I think this is some of it, sort of, you can look at self-esteem as just a way to reinforce your self-perspective. It's thought of this, this wonderful thing that just once you have it, it stays. But to some degree, we need to sort of see some repetition of that persona that we built in our mind reappearing on a regular basis. And that keeps us having a positive outlook and happy. And if you go into the gym and you say, you know what, I have a drive within me that is this basic to how I understand my person to be. It's basic to me, that I can express in that gym, that I can go in and be a warrior. I think sometimes it's not really one of Jung's typical archetypes, standard archetypes, but I think of kind of a warrior archetype that, and this is not in no way to say going to the gym and training is like going to war. It's not, I mean, obviously it's very different things. And it's not like fighting, but there's something about many people who like to go and train really hard that is just, it's part of their nature. And I live near the river, and I think this has something to do with there's water, and I've got brand new electrical in my house, but it's not even raining right now. It'll just go out for a split second like that.
Just pops off like that. That's cool.
Yeah.
So I just cut all that out. So we just had a bit of an interruption for anyone following that. I'll edit this out. So I guess where I was going with this was, I think it's fair to say that competitive bodybuilders, at least professional athletes, are today exposing themselves to what I would consider to be unsustainable levels of enhancement practice that you may well get away with for a couple of years. And I'm quite outspoken on this. What you can get away with for, say, 2 years is vastly different from what you can do for 22 years.
Right.
So I'm curious as to what your point of view or perspective would be on that regard. Maybe I can share mine first, and you feel free to pull it apart. I am not at all, fragile about people disagreeing with my opinion on anything. So I am a big fan of what I call the supernatural man. And the premise of the supernatural man is, so rather than blasting away, and this does not apply to people that have aspirations for the IFBB pro stage. This is serious recreational lifters, amateurs like myself. the premise is that rather than having a phasic model where you expose yourself to relatively high supraphysiological doses of androgens and growth hormones and insulins and all these sorts of things, interceded with periods supposedly a physiological level. Very often we don't even see that. People are cruising at 500 milligrams of testosterone today.
Right.
I personally, and I don't have any evidence to support this because of the nature of polypharmacy at play here. I personally believe that, a model where you fundamentally, incrementally modulate a number of different metabolic pathways, but really just outside of what we would call therapeutic dose. So if we were to accept that there are many people today, using, let's just arbitrarily say 2 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of testosterone and quite unquote calling it TRT, that 200 milligram kind of range, then I think it's fair to say there's an acceptable margin of safety where you could quite plausibly raise that to 250 and say, look, it's disingenuous to say there's no risk, but it's probably acceptable risk, to stay there for a long time, a very, very long time. And so I like this model where you go, okay, so we're going to have some tests and some insulin, some growth hormone and some metabolic modulators and some metformin and some.
Right.
A large, long list of drugs, but when you look at the clinical doses, we are either at or below, or in some cases, a little higher than therapeutic levels. And the result of that is then a physiological state where you sure as shit ain't natural.
Right. Oh yeah.
But the level of stress that's involved is you can't see it through blood work. Right? Now I don't feel that it's honest to say just because you can't see it through blood work that says it does not exist. I think that's also disingenuous. But I find it a much preferable model than just to follow the blast and cruise model until you get into trouble, quote unquote.
Right. Yes.
Yep. Which is what most people do in my experience. They do it, and they do it, and they do it, and then they get a health scare. And then if the scare is big enough, they'll pull their head in. Right? But I believe that model is a very good model. Now, the challenge, of course, is you will have people that will say, well, insulin is not for beginners and growth hormone is not required for people that are not doing this and that, not doing that. And the argument would be, well, it's kind of like, well, it depends on the dose, right? If you're talking about, 2 units of growth hormone, that's just going to place you outside of natural range by a small margin. It's, in theory, not even going to escalate known conditions like insulin resistance and things like that. In my experience, it does not. So I'm curious as to what your strategy would be or your recommendation if someone says, look, Scott, I'm enhanced. I don't want to be fucking natural, buddy, but I want to do this for 20 years. What would you tell them? What advice would you give them? What model would you propose?
Well, when do you mean this? Do you mean just be the supernatural man, so to speak, and continue to train, like not getting on stage?
Well, I would argue both. I'm just talking about someone that, so whether you choose to stand on stage or whether you choose to be a strength athlete or whether you choose to just do it for your own, setting of goals, whatever they mean, however arbitrary they may be, right? And you would choose the enhanced pathway. So we're not talking about an individual using TRT. He's using performance-enhancing drugs. So if I said, right, so here's a model where I want you to take 300 milligrams of testosterone and 2 units of growth hormone and 5 units of Humalog and 500 milligrams of metformin and 80 micrograms, 80 milligrams of telmisartan. So you see what I'm saying? We're stacking these very well-known, very easily to describe methodologies of actions, performance enhancement tools on the table, one on top of each other, fundamentally not very far above, clinical dosages. But the expectation is, provided that your blood work and provided that your health markers and provided your yearly echocardiogram and support the model, then I would put that model as a preferential model for longevity, over someone that says, look, I'm just going to use 1,000 milligrams a week of steroids. And I don't use growth hormone because I don't need growth hormone. You understand the mindset you get?
Absolutely.
A lot of people will say to me, you don't need growth hormone if you're like an amateur. Like, this is quite common, it's for very advanced trainers. And I would argue, well, I would rather take 300 milligrams of test and 2 units of growth hormone than 600 milligrams of test.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Right.
so I think it's a safer model. I personally believe that to be true. Yeah.
Right.
So if you were to say to someone, right, here's an individual who is enhanced, he's an amateur competitor, let's say, or a serious recreational lifter, either or, and says, look, I'm in this game for the next. I need a strategy that's going to see me clear for the next 25 years, and I don't want to do TRT. What are my options, Scott?
Right.
What are his options?
So there's a couple things, and I'm very non-judgmental about all of this, and it's funny because they've actually asked, talking about high-end Olympic level, world champion level athletes. I think there's a study where they asked Olympic level athletes, if you could win your gold medal, or if you could, this the question comes up, if you could win the Mr. Olympia and then you die.
This is the Goldman dilemma, yeah?
Yeah, people would just do it.
Yeah.
So some people are at that end. So what you're talking about there is looking at creating a synergy with as many different super supplementation types of approaches in a way that each minimizes the risk, but adds effectively or synergizes effectively to the overall input that you get to make you into the superhuman man, so to speak. I like that term, by the way. That's nice. Or woman in the case of the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Superhuman person, we should say.
Superhuman person, right? Yeah, we gotta be careful.
Yeah.
So the thing that we don't know is there's going to be a dose response, of course, for any drug in terms of what its pharmacodynamics would be, but there's also going to be a dose response in terms of risk.
Yep.
So, and everyone has to sort of figure out there's an unknown there. You don't know. There could be some interaction. So the worst case scenario, you have to, I think the one way to approach is to say, what is the worst thing that could happen here? And it could be that what you think on average, most people could have sustained for 20 years is something that for whatever reason you cannot. It's not going to work for you. And you end up with just an absolute unforeseen worst case scenario. There is someone that I know who's no longer with us, actually, who had a particular genetic proclivity for liver cancer that was likely brought on by, I believe it was pituitary hormones, I believe growth hormone in particular, such that which he or she would not have known about unless a screening specifically looking for that particular very, very odd I think it was a single nucleotide polymorphism that was very unique. And in this case, small amounts or even just replacement of growth hormone would increase the risk for liver cancer, and that person actually didn't make it because of that. So there are unforeseens, and you'd hate to have someone, for instance, who their life goals change, and at the end of like 10 or 15 years, they recognize they put themselves at a risk that they once accepted and now no longer do accept. And then they have a regret of what they once did. And of course, the regret's always going to be framed. When you think of it 15 years down the road, and now you're seeing what this worst case scenario might be, then you would have a regret that you wouldn't have felt a year beforehand because you're not even thinking about those things. Sure. You may have enjoyed all 14 and a half years up until that 15th year when the shit hits the fan for some unforeseen reason. And the idea I think really that I'm getting at is to sit and really ponder, am I willing to take these risks? Am I like one of these high-level Olympic athletes who would be willing to just die after winning the gold because it's that important? Or is this sort of me trying to justify what I'm doing here, and I'm really not okay with the worst-case scenario? If you could take that worst-case scenario and say, you know what? This is a calculated risk that I'm taking, and I'm willing to accept the worst case possibilities. And maybe even write this down. A lot of times it's very informative for people to write things down on paper, share it with a spouse, share it with people that that are close to them that would miss them if something happens. Then you're good to go, I think, without a doubt. So you have to
I might have asked that question badly. Let me
No, I don't think you did. I always frame things from the big picture.
Okay. Yeah.
So for some people, there could be people who are willing to they'd rather have 10, 15 years where they know they're pushing the limits and they're losing 5 years off their life expectancy. They're willing to take that. What you're talking about is really having a very minimal, and I like the approach. There's still an unknown.
Absolutely. Polypharmacy is the unknown, correct?
Yeah, right. Yeah, the interactions or simply that. I mean, here's the thing, just to give us more perspective on this, is that if you look at life expectancy up until, the last, I don't know exactly, I can't tell you the exact number of years, but basically people weren't living beyond 35, 40 years until a few centuries ago. So what is built into our genetics through the course of evolution doesn't necessarily favor living beyond that period of time. There were obviously long-lived individuals for many, many years.
Yep.
But there wasn't a strong selective pressure to create a population of humans that would live into their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So what we're talking about there is basically sort of genetics that are set up to keep the strong and get, at least in case of men, get them through, and women too, get them through those reproductive years. Correct. So their DNA can be passed on. And Correct. What happens after that could be like the total crumbling of the house of cards.
Yep,
it may just collapse. So you don't
know.
And
that is true for most species beyond reproductive years.
Yes.
Longevity is a mute issue, right?
It's an interesting thing. Yeah. Like in humans, there's like, for instance, the grandmother hypothesis. Like what would be the purpose of a woman living beyond menopause? I don't mean that in any like derogatory sense. It's like biologically, right. And that's to carry on the wisdom that she has accrued over the course of her lifetime, pass that down in terms of, legend within the tribes, and like to help grandmothers would help.
But mothers, I think it's fair to say you also only needed a few individuals to do that, right?
Right, exactly. So as long as there was a few of them were surviving. So take for instance testosterone, and what happens. And there's mixed literature on this. I think you've had Scott Howell on, maybe even addressed this.
Yeah, he's coming on this week. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Yeah. So maybe there may be some huge variability in the impact of maintaining youthful levels or slightly above normal levels of testosterone once someone gets into their 50s and 60s or even 70s, that otherwise would not be the case. So whatever risk you have when you're 20 or 30 being at slightly above the normal range might not apply whatsoever to what kind of risk you have when you're in your 50s, when normally you'd be at 500 as opposed to 1,500 or 1,200.
Yep.
So that's kind of an unknown, and that's like, it's sort of a genetic crapshoot to some degree, because we're talking about, they're really kind of given years, or years that we didn't get as humans just a few centuries back.
Just a couple of generations ago. Agreed.
Yeah, in large part. So
maybe I could just try and summarize what I was trying to say there. I said I'm not sure I did a great job. I guess what I'm saying is that would be a conversation for someone who's contemplating coming down the enhancement path, as I did many years ago. But I'm more referencing people that have already made that decision. Do you know?
Right.
And they're saying, look, I'm coming down this path whether you like it or not, Scott. Move out the way.
Right. Sure.
So give me some advice here. Am I better off blasting and cruising, or incrementally raising up multiple metabolic pathways, just outside of physiological range, and fundamentally not experiencing those periods of heightened stress, but using drugs that would typically not be identified as necessarily the drugs of amateurs. Let me just show you a slide here, and I'll get your commentary on this, because I think this is what underlies this conversation many times with me. So, of the development and progression of type 2 diabetes. Now, this is obviously not specific to our cohort, not specific to our tribe, but the reason I'm very interested in this is because I truly believe that some of the behaviors that we engage in our tribe, specifically the pounding of food that we do at abnormally high caloric intakes, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 calories a day in high protein, low fat, high carbohydrate diets, has the potential to place tremendous strain on the pancreas over decades of this use. And you can see in this, people can see in this graphic that degradation of beta cell function actually occurs potentially up to 10 years before we even see diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. It starts 10 years before you see significant fasting and post-meal glucose control problems. So an example is, I am quite a big fan of saying, look, you know, if you are intaking very high carbohydrate foods as part of our behavior of our tribe, and you're going to be doing it for 30 years, you probably want to consider, you know, a tool like, you know, the moderate use of insulin as an anti-aging practice. And this is not, you know, the way that insulin is typically viewed, but I believe that this has the potential to help us with longevity in that regard. So do you have an opinion? And the reason I ask you is, if you speak to many people about insulin, they will say to you, it's not a preventative tool for type 2 diabetes. It's a tool that you pull out as last line of response to, you know, an existing disease state. Do you have an opinion, any and all feedback you have on this? I'm interested in.
Yeah, the logic makes absolute sense. And when someone is really, really pushing the food, they're really, really pushing their ability to, like, their body mass is gone. I mean, the average bodybuilder who really goes from where he might have been constitutively in terms of muscle mass with no training to his peak, he might have put on 100 pounds at least, maybe even 100 pounds of fat-free mass and muscle mass. That's a large step away from what would otherwise have happened to that individual were it not for the bodybuilding bug having bit them. So without a doubt, that makes perfect sense to support the pancreas in that way. But like you said, that those data come from individuals who eventually become pre-diabetic and then diabetic with type 2 diabetes. So they're a little bit different. They're not exercising typically. So, you know, one of the main depots for glucose disposal is skeletal muscles, the one we can sort of impact the most with exercise. So there's a different scenario. So that's a scientific issue, but I think that's moot once you're at 250 pounds and you're trying to eat 6,000 calories a day. That can very much be helpful without a doubt. So that's a great. And back to your question with the longevity with those individuals, it's going to where you go with that synergistic approach to using small amounts that would add up together to create someone who has a physique that's way beyond what it would be otherwise, is how far beyond their natural physique, or at least we're not going to consider the hypogonadal situation, because someone goes hypogonadal, eventually they'll deteriorate over the course of years. But if you keep them at above normal levels of testosterone and use all the other pharmaceuticals you mentioned, how far does that person want to stay? What's acceptable to them? And that's the thing as well that you'd have to gauge. Some people might think, well, gosh, I competed at, you know, in the 220s and I want to walk around, you know, maybe like 5 or 10 pounds less than that. And it may have taken them monstrous doses to get to where they once were. As a competitor, they might not be satisfied with that. So they have to juggle what is realistic given that supernatural human approach, which may mean that instead of being 185, they just did a basic TRT protocol. Now they're 200. Are they okay with that? And so there's going to be there's a sliding range where you have to kind of consider, like, for instance, telmisartan, if you're going to use, it's an angiotensin receptor blocker, I believe, right?
Yeah, and the PPAR agonist, which is why I favor the drug, because it activates all three isoforms of PPAR, which is fabulous for us, right? So,
okay, yeah, right. So you know, that might, if you think about just that particular drug, is that the person's blood pressure, maybe it's normal, maybe it's not, maybe that tends them, they see a particular effect there. But maybe it creates a low blood pressure situation for them.
Yeah, I completely understand that argument, but at least in my experience, I don't recall seeing someone that uses, you know, that is from our tribe that has low blood pressure.
No, probably not.
The opposite is true.
Yes,
I'm yet to see that. So yeah.
Yeah. So you'd want to think about where the person wants to be on that scale between their best fully loaded version.
Agreed.
To where they would be if they're just sort of using the minimum, which might be just HRT, no insulin, no angiotensin receptor blockers, no none of the other things that you've mentioned, none of that. And where do they want to be in that scale? And then what would be the thought there is, which of those choices in that varied toolbox of drugs that they're going to use at very low, hopefully lacking in side effect doses, are the ones that they want to choose to do so. And maybe some create more side effects than others. And you could look at various things, like, for instance, if the testosterone goes up and they just tend to find that is the drug for them, which is picking this out sort of randomly, but that's the drug for them that seems to skew their blood lipids more than anything. That one they might just stay with a lower dose of testosterone, looking at that set of side effects, and raise the scale on growth hormone to 3 IUs.
Correct.
Because growth hormone, they don't get carpal tunnel. They don't have, it doesn't impact their blood glucose at all between two versus 3.
Yep.
So there's going to be, and this is individualizing your approach, given the person's family history, what you see in that blood work. It may be that there's better choices amongst all those drugs that they choose to use to become supernatural, which is their own specific supernatural human cocktail, which basically contains different doses of those different drugs, which they may take in and out as well. There's something to say there potentially with the idea that if you've got some side effect that may accrue over time or have an adverse effect over time, this is actually combining the blast cruise notion. Someone might use some of those drugs at higher levels and then vary them over time. So there's sort of an oscillation of the doses to have some off time from whichever of those might have some subclinical side effect you're not aware of. So when the testosterone goes down, the growth hormone might go up, and vice versa. So that would be another way to sort of modify that based on what you do see, if anything, with the blood work. You're shooting blind to some degree. If you got nothing in the blood work and you're doing calcium score tests and you're getting echoes on your heart, and you're doing the full litany of medical tests to assess your health and your risk profile, and you're seeing nothing, well, that's a very good sign, obviously.
Yes.
But if you can,
and this is the interesting thing, in my opinion and my experience, that is very possible, because I do it myself, and I've done it with many clients, and it's very interesting when you look at the blood work. You go, well, apart from the clearly elevated testosterone levels and estrogen levels in that ratio, you couldn't really tell it using drugs. Like, you would have to be looking for the drugs, which is interesting, because when I see people come to me that have a blasting mentality, you could, one look at the blood work, you know what's going on. Like, like you need to take a break. I can clearly see stress down down through the system. So it is just it's my opinion, but again, it's not something I don't know anyone else that follows this methodology. Like, I've never seen anyone doing this supernatural model saying most people go physiological levels of just testosterone and interceded with super physiological. Now, how hard you push is very, very variable. But I've never seen anyone have this incremental model. And I said, I get a lot of pushback from people saying, like, yeah, but HGH isn't for that group, and insulin's not for that group, and what do you need to take telmisartan for if you don't have high blood pressure? And I would make an argument all the way along. Anyway, rather than make that too detailed, maybe just for people watching, I can take a couple of minutes to explain a little bit about that framework, and then we'll maybe move on. So, just for anyone watching, I have a personal belief that says, look, if you're going to use these drugs over multi-year timeframes, you should probably do the following thing, which is create 2 piles of drugs, and in one pile of drug, we call them basal PEDs, and they're going to become our firm friends over the next 20 years. We're going to know them intimately. And you have another pile of drugs we will call situational use. So we would use these for competition. We might use these for breaking through a plateau or something. And fundamentally, when you look at down the list of regular suspects, I would say, look, if it's a methylated oral steroid with known liver toxicity, you put that in the situational use basket. This is not for daily use over a multi-year time frame. If it is a veterinary steroid that has been evaluated for human use and not approved, like boldenone, you put that in that basket, right? Fundamentally, what you want to have is drugs that are either currently in human clinical use, or drugs like Masteron, which were in human clinical use and not removed because of concerns, but they were superseded by a drug that just did the job better, in the case of Masteron. It wasn't pulled from the market so much as it was displaced by a better drug.
Right.
Then those are the drugs you should spend most of your career using. Approved for human use drugs, we have good clinical literature on. We know what is an effective and tolerable dose in humans, and spend most of your time on that drug, in that list, in the basal periods. I'm not a fan of research chemicals where we don't know enough about. I'm not a fan of SARMs. I just want to get your opinion on, I think you would agree with me that, you know, at a fundamental level, that's a reasonable framework, Scott, yeah?
I do agree with you. The thing is that there's so many potential tools, and one of the things, like for instance with SARMs or with the research drugs, is they're shiny objects that people want to try because they're looking for sort of a magic bullet. Yeah. So, but we have so many that, in order to do what you're talking about, not try to get that last 0.1% or that last 0.5%, you can use basic drugs of the kind you just mentioned, and get a lot with known good risk to reward ratios.
Yeah, correct. So I just wanted to just on that subject, I personally am not a fan of secretagogues, right? And the reason I'm not a fan of secretagogues is because I think that, you know, it may well be a viable metabolic pathway in an acute sense, but the idea of turning up the endocrine system to 11 over a multi-decade time frame, just to me smacks of like, that just doesn't sound like a good idea. So drugs like MK677, for example, which are basically, you know, forcing the body to produce more growth hormone, sound fabulous, right? But in reality, I would go, look, if you're interested in longevity, then overdriving the endocrine system, as it were, over a multi-year time frame, that might not be a first-line choice to me. Would you agree in general that secretagogues carry that risk of, if you overdrive something long enough, you have the potential to place undue stress on that system?
Yeah. So here's the thing with secretagogues that, and maybe this is how I sort of look at them. Continuing to do that, probably not a good idea. It would be akin to, and I'm going to make an analogy, and I love analogies as well. It'd be akin to using excessive doses of HCG in order to elevate testosterone. You don't really need to do that.
Wrong tool for the job, yeah.
Right. However, like one of the pituitary has multiple cells that produce the various pituitary hormones. And there's a very intricate organization amongst those cells. And if, for instance, you're using, let's say you take your growth hormone and it's 2 or 3 IUs per day, but you're spreading that out in a way that you're constantly depressing pituitary, the normal pulsatile pituitary growth hormone output, then basically in the same way that TRT would be suppressing gonadal output of testosterone, you're doing that with growth hormone to some degree. You're pressing that down. So the notion that those could be useful, at least in my mind, comes from the idea that for someone who wants to do sort of a PCT from using growth hormone, employ the secretagogues for a short period of time. And of course, you'd have to measure, if you want to get a pulsatile measurement, you're not going to get that done very well at just going into your local Quest Labs or LabCorp or something like that. But the idea would be that you could have, and I haven't seen this before, maybe you have anyone who has, from taking growth hormone for so long, lost normal pulsatility in their growth hormone production. And
so that's interesting you say that, because let me just run a couple of things by you and then agree. So in men, where we see long-term issues with reestablishment of the HPTA after multi-year shutdown, it is, I have never seen it documented that it is actually the pituitary gland at issue. It's effectively the testes. So in other words, changes to the ultrastructure of or the morphology of the testicles that is the underlying reason behind the problem for production. And so if you take the test,
there are data on that actually.
Oh, is there really? Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. I might get you to pass that on to me, because I've never seen that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll have to read up on that and come back. I'll cut that short.
Both you can have secondary or primary, but yeah. hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism is the.
Oh, sorry.
is the
Let
fancy
me
term.
let me rephrase that. Sorry, I
Sure.
probably said that wrong. I'm talking about anabolic steroid-induced hypergonadism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not aware of any literature that supports the idea that the use of steroids, when it shuts down at primary level, it's always secondary. It's always at the testicles. Is that incorrect?
I know that in the hypogonadism literature,
Yes,
actually, I believe
agree.
that the majority is hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism.
Yes.
Steroids can be toxic to
Mm-hmm.
the testes. They are, which is
Yep.
something that, for what it's worth, there's some literature showing taurine can help with that.
Yep. Correct.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yep.
So yeah, I haven't seen that studied. That's the best literature that would look into that idea in steroid users. So
I can't remember who the authors are, but there is a meta-analysis that looks at fertility issues in long-term steroid users, and they look at return to LH values and FSH values after multi-years of abuse, and there seems to be no problem. It's the lighting cells in the testes that become effectively damaged through oxidative stress that they are unable to produce testosterone at optimal levels. And double to that, if you think about the way that female hormonal contraception works, effectively we're shutting these systems down potentially for 20, 15 years. Now, it's fair to say when you remove, these contraceptive tools, that women could take some time to come back.
Yeah, it can be a long while for many women.
But it's interesting that it's my experience that when you remove the negative feedback loop from growth hormone, within relatively short order, within a couple of weeks, you start to see the restoration. I've never seen an individual that had the problem. And so
and I don't know, the thing is, you'll go in and get a baseline measurement, but you just get a shot in time when you take one blood draw at your Quest Labs. You're not getting a measure of pulsatility and the height of those peaks, et cetera.
I guess I tend to reference, because obviously there's an IGF HGH feedback loop, you remove the growth hormone, effectively IGF over time will diminish. So if you see the restoration of growth hormone, consequential to that, you see the restoration of IGF-1 levels. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, IGF-1 it raises and comes back down on the order of weeks. It takes some time for that to build up.
Yeah, but if someone was to stop HGH and go and get blood work, let's just arbitrarily say 6 weeks later, and they had elevated IGF-1 levels at normal range, let's just say, you could make a fair assumption that the IGF-1 HGH axis had restored. Is that fair?
Well, that's what I don't know, and I've looked to tease some of this out, because IGF-1 is very much, there's the somatomedin hypothesis. Growth hormone stimulates IGF-1 production from the liver, and there's also IGF-1 production locally at the target tissues for growth hormone. But IGF-1 systemically is very reflective of nutritional status. So burn victims, it goes into the hole. If you're starving, it goes into the hole. When you're starving, growth hormone goes up.
Yes. Yeah.
So IGF-1 goes down.
As a stress hormone, though, correct?
Well, and for mobilizing fat stores for energy.
Correct. Yeah.
Like that's so I would call it's a stress hormone in that sense, is that its role in someone who's already matured, who's post-adolescent, who's no longer growing, is largely fuel regulation. And so growth hormone levels go up when you sleep. And typically that's because you're post-absorptive for some period of time. You don't have food coming in. So it's shifting the use of fats versus blood glucose and other stored glycogen. So yeah, the IGF-1 is reflective of the somatomedin hypothesis, but it's also reflective of just what your caloric balance is in general. Also, testosterone increases IGF-1, androgen increases IGF-1. So there's a number of inputs there. So it's not the best. You could see, like, one thing, I don't know, people back in the day when they try to get growth hormone prescriptions, you could just diet really hard for a few weeks and go in, and if they measured IGF-1, I need it for anti-aging. It's like, no, you're just dieting really hard. So.
This is part of the. This is a side discussion, but it's part of the argument about. I have long argued that, as someone that used to be a drug-free athlete, that it's actually plausible that some use of enhancement practices would potentially be healthier than natural bodybuilding, because when you're dieting down, when you crash insulin, you crash growth hormone, you crash testosterone, you spike cortisol, ghrelin, and leptin. And it's just such a mess that if you did nothing more than re-establish those levels to baseline, no performance outcome at all, you're potentially in a better place, physiologically than you are as a, I don't use drugs. I'm a natural athlete. This is healthier. So it's a very complicated conversation because obviously nobody does that, right? But
yeah, well, I mean, that's the old school way. John Meadows talks about this too, is that you would just only use the drugs. You'd be natural essentially the rest of the year. Not that you're calling yourself natural, you're clean. And then you would just diet down on gear. And of course that would put you in a super physiological state. But if you took someone who otherwise as a natural athlete would have testosterone levels that, went down to the hypogonadal range and just kept them at normal while they're dieting on, treacherously low calories, that would have a performance effect. Absolutely. I would suspect. Yeah.
And for anyone listening, that is the absolute precise reason that TRT, even medically prescribed TRT, is banned in natural federations. You're not allowed to use TRT because it may not seem like an advantage, and it's not until you undergo extended caloric deficit, and then you realize how big an advantage it is to not get into that condition. So yeah, it's a fascinating. I can see we're up to an hour 20 already. I could talk about this. Let me just quickly.
The secretagogue thing is an interesting one because that would be. Yeah, so the long-term use probably, and it depends on what you're doing. Like, are you like people were trying to fit this in between meals 3 or 4 or 5 times a day, and with a large enough dose, or they called it boom dosing is one of the terms they've seen. That you could definitely stress out your pituitary potentially, and I'd be interested to see because I haven't seen anything like I think my sense is that most people recover in terms of growth hormone output. But who knows, over the course of 20 years of depressing normal pituitary release, let's say on a continuous basis, because like I said, those cells are spatially situated amongst one another. There's interaction between all of those pituitary hormones. Would there be some degradation that you could perhaps prevent by at least getting the pituitary up and running now and again, like, go 6 weeks and then spend a week doing a sort of a mini PCT. The thing that's different about the pituitary, of course, versus testosterone, although there's a circadian rhythm in testosterone, like many hormones, is there's the pituitary, and this is also applies to the pancreas. It's a very pulsatile type of scenario. So that in and of itself, because it's by its nature, it's increasing and then decreasing output regularly on the course of an hourly basis throughout the day. It's going to be less likely to have a down regulation, I would suspect. So, but if you're constantly doing that for weeks on end, maybe there could be some health benefits.
It's interesting because this is just an observation, but because growth hormone traditionally has been expensive and hard to source, probably more than any other drug, it's the one drug that people use intermittently.
Yeah, right.
So you would think that you think anecdotally at least we would see something, because even like testosterone, you can say, well, guys go on testosterone, they stay on there for fucking 5 years, they never come off,
Right.
But I think few individuals could afford to do that with growth hormone at the levels that you see in practice, 6, 8, 10 IU. So it is almost by definition a drug that you see intermittent use on. The
other thing about growth hormone that occurs to me too, and I wonder, this is one of the things that I suspect might be why, at least I tend to see this, and maybe you do too, there seems to be a wide range of responsiveness to growth hormone. So there are some guys, they feel like, oh, this is just the best thing since sliced bread. I take growth hormone, I just transform. It turns me into a mutant. And other people, like, I've got the good stuff, I'm using the same stuff my buddy got, and it really doesn't do much for me. I just experience sides. And that's the growth hormone that you're getting is just one of the isoforms of growth hormone produced by the pituitary. So it's the 22 kilodalton isoform. There's a smaller one that's produced in higher amounts for instance, in response to exercise. And that actually 20 kilodalton one doesn't tend to cause as much insulin resistance, at least from some of the research I've seen. So there might be, I've always wondered why if maybe some people who really are fans of the secretagogues might be getting a better effect from secretagogues, or relatively better effect from secretagogues versus from the exogenous growth hormones, because they're more sensitive because of the growth hormone receptors and it's an isoform effect essentially.
That's interesting.
Yeah, there could be something to say for that. It'd be really interesting to see a study where they just take the 20 kilodalton, they do a double blind, and compare and whomever, and say which one, what's going on here.
It's the great frustration I have with so much of the evidence. I go, yeah, but that's not what I want to see. That's really interesting, but I want to see this.
I know.
It is the nature of this.
It makes sense for studying growth dwarfs, though. I mean, perhaps there's various, and antibody formation as well is an issue potentially. That's a kind of a mixed bag there too. But anyway, you got something else you want to bring up?
I'm just concerned about your time. That's all. So let me ask you, because we're going to run out of time, some questions about longevity and volume and training intensity, because I know training is something that you're very passionate about and very well known for. So one of the things that frustrates me a little bit is when I listen to individuals in this community that have very high profiles that talk about training practices, really talk about the things that potentially affect us in terms of longevity. So one of the classics at the moment is there has been for a couple of years now this big push towards volume as the primary driver of hypertrophy. And not getting into that debate, but just getting to the concept of saying, look, even if you exhibit absolutely flawless form in every rep on every set, I'm not sure any of us have ever claimed that. But
certainly not me.
it's somewhat akin to purchasing, a new car and saying, right, I bought a brand new Porsche and I intend to, give this to my son when I pass. So I want this to be a pristine car. Even if you use it as a taxi and you put 1 million miles on the fucking thing, it's going to be worthless by the time it gets into his hands, because it's just got so many miles on the clock.
Right.
And I always tell people, look, and forget all about that. You need to do the minimum amount of intensity and the minimum amount of volume that you need to realize your goals and no more. Because anything you do on top of that is just, adding mileage to the car. Unnecessarily, because you've already achieved your goals. So this is a very controversial thing, and I have offended a number of people over the years that are very high profile, because I've said, look, I'm not arguing with you that your training strategy produces fabulous outcomes in hypertrophy, but it has the potential to needlessly, limit our longevity in the practice, because you're placing unnecessary stress on the tendons and the soft tissue. To what end? If I can do 6 sets and get an outcome, gives a shit. That's what I need to do, right? You might want to argue that I need to do 20 sets, but if I get the outcome that I seek at 6 sets, why would I do 10? What valid reason could I possibly have for doing 10 if I realize my goals at 6? And yet, you never hear this spoken of in terms of you want to do the minimum amount of work you need to do. It's kind of I look at it from if you're an entrepreneur or whatever like that, you say, well, why would you work, 100 hours a week if you can get the job done in 40? Go home and enjoy your life.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I'm interested. Do you agree with that? Why do we not hear people saying, look, if you want to be an IB professional and you want to be 300 pounds, you may well fucking have to do that. That's probably the reality of it. But if you're just an average guy that wants to look good naked, you don't need to do anywhere near that amount of work. And yet this is why I'm saying that most of what we are taught is the legacy of genetically elite individuals who are seeking outcomes at this level. And it just doesn't apply to your average gym rat. Those training models, like I said, the classic one is, I know you're a huge advocate of high intensity training. I trained that style for many, many years. And I think it's a fabulous way to grow. It's probably the most efficient way to grow tissue mass. But I also feel that if it's not done very carefully, you can increase your risk of getting hurt. Right. So how would you answer my point, saying, why don't we just do the minimum amount of work we need to do and go home?
Oh gosh, there's so many things there. One, I'm not an HIT. I've never actually done Menser's HIT, be honest. So I'm not a fan of his philosophy. Kind of changed over the years.
Yeah.
My take on that is that an essential component of the stimulus is the fact that it's so effortful. It's way beyond what we normally encounter in our day-to-day life.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to take advantage of that, especially if someone gets more and more trained, training harder and harder is going to be more important, because if you're doing sets of 12 when you're a beginner versus sets of 12 when you're advanced, those last 3 or 4 reps might be considered effective in producing growth as a beginner, whereas you're only going to get maybe 1 rep or 2 reps as an advanced training, and now you're using maybe 2 or 3 times the weight you used to use. And in order to get anything that would be considered a stimulus for new growth, you have to train even harder than you ever have before, to some degree. You can't stop 2 reps shy, in large part, and expect to get much from that, or at least the same amount as you would have when you're younger. So some of the model of, there's a dose response to volume, without a doubt. Most of those studies have been done with untrained individuals. And and I've talked about this now on several podcasts. There's interesting studies, and I'll send them to you, that were done looking at basically the influence of frequency on muscle growth. And they use a model where one leg of a subject is trained, in this case, 5 times a week. It was also varied volume too. So it's not a perfect study in terms of isolating just the frequency aspect of training, but 5 times a week versus 2 times a week or 3 times a week. And when they looked at those averages, they found that it didn't matter which way you trained in those subjects that they tested. And then when they published a follow-up study, they lumped the 2 and 3 times a week together. And then when you plot out for the individuals the amount of growth that you saw people who were extraordinary responders, you saw people who were nearly non-responders, and some people did better from the 5 times a week, and some people did better from the 2 or 3 times a week. So what the optimal training dose is going to be in terms of volume is going to be very much a function of the individual. So taking the idea that you need to go with 8 sets a week or 15 sets a week or 20 sets a week, and that's going to be the volume that you would need, really doesn't pay attention to the individual variability that you see, which is now being demonstrated more and more in the research, which we've known. Like, you see people in the gym. I would love to be able to train like Tom Platz did or what have you. I've tried doing that. I just don't have the recovery resources. I train all day long.
I think my point is, it's fair to say also that, no one listening to this is Tom Platz. You don't need to train like Tom Platz because you're not Tom Platz.
Right.
You follow my logic of saying, and if you train like Tom Platz, then probably it's going to be game over within 10 years.
Yes,
right?
yes. He's still training though, but yes.
Very true, but yeah. So one of the techniques that I like to use, and the reason I'm flashing the plus is I don't see anyone else training, and maybe you see individuals doing it, so you might go, no, that's not true. There are other individuals, but one of the things I like to use is what I call, or what are commonly referred to as fractional plates. So they come in
micro loading, sure.
Micro loading. You're in and so in other words, I don't need to put 5 pounds on the bar. If I put 1/4 pound on the bar next week, this is enough for me because it's more.
Yes.
And yet I don't walk. I walk into the gym with like micro plates, and people look at me and go, "What the fuck is that?" Like, to the point of like nobody sees these things because nobody. I mean, I don't see people advocating these techniques. I don't see people using these techniques, and yet to me, it just makes perfect sense. It says, look, I need to create a progressive overload model that is effective for me as a unique individual. But the smallest increment I can manage is this increment that makes the most sense. Not why do I need to put 10 pounds in there? Why do I need to squat 6 plates a side? I just need more. Right? And so if you go up in fractional plates, you, in my opinion, lower the risk of injury, because what you did last week versus this week is not a big difference. It's a very small difference, and yet it's enough to grow, because if that stimulus was enough for me as a unique individual, 1/4, 1 pound more is favorable for that outcome. And I guess, again, I go back to the thing, but I don't hear anyone talking about fractional plates. They're talking about jumping up a set, which is a huge increment to me.
Yes. So, and there's obviously there's going to be inverse relationship between how hard you train and the volume that you can recover from.
Yep.
If you're training as hard as you possibly can and taking your sets to a 0 reps in reserve or to failure, 5 sets might be plenty. That might be all you can do, and not being accruing junk volume, which is kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're leaving 2 or 3 sets in the reps in the tank each time, you could do 10. Dante Trudell has talked about this. I talk about this all the time. You take, let's say someone just goes up with, let's just make the math easy. They go up, they've got an exercise rotation where they squat every 3 weeks, and they squat about a dozen times in a year. They take some breaks in there, and they just add, let's make it just 2.5 pounds each time. There's like literally 1.25 pound plates on either side. They're micro loading, and they do that a dozen times, 2.5 pounds. So they're getting roughly 30 pounds on their squat. They do that for 3 years. They've added 90 pounds to their squat. Almost imperceptible. You've gone up an extra plate on each side. If your reps are staying the same, that's going to manifest in the size of the muscles that you're using when you squat. It might just be your glutes and hamstrings, but it's going to show up somewhere in your physique. And that's the real gold in that, is that you're progressively overloading in a way that you don't even notice, except that you're loading the bar. Like, it's not like, oh shit, like this is going to be rough, this is heavy, and you get buried. It happens very, very slowly.
But in my experience, it's when you do that you get injured.
Yeah. There's the key point there is being able to properly auto-regulate. So the thing that many people can't do, and this is sort of being honest with yourself, there will be days, and I've got this built into my training system as well, but there will be days where you're like, you know what? I'm going to stick with the same weight. I'm going to try to get at least 1 more rep on the 3 sets that I'm doing. And that's all I'm shooting for. I trained yesterday and actually did better than I thought I was going to do, but I'm helping someone move. I think I mentioned before, so I'm feeling the effects of that, but I still want to go in and train. I dropped my volume down. I'm using my volume tiers approach in fortitude training. And I'm like, I just want to get 10 reps on each of these sets. I was doing 1 set of leg press, a knee extension, a hamstring curl. And that's all I said in my head. This is going to be a bump up in my logbook. I didn't try to move the weight up. I didn't try to do anything. And I got that. But there will be days then, like maybe I go in and I've rested really well. Had like a movie day with the dogs the day before. I go into the gym and I'm just ready to rip holes in the wall. That's when I know I can address that ability that I sense because I'm auto-regulating and make a bump up, but it matches my recovery state and my mental state, which is part of that. So you want to take advantage of those too, to some degree, whenever you can, but it's being smart about it and not saying, okay, like if I try to like go and bump things up, that wouldn't have made sense yesterday. Just wouldn't have happened. Some of that was probably psychological. Some of it was just being smart. Like, I don't want to injure myself, which is obviously very important. So it's a mixture of those things, and recognizing that the progressive overload, as long as you're going up in reps or load, is going to happen to some degree. And maybe it doesn't. Maybe you should stick with the same weight, and maybe it doesn't. Well, you give yourself another shot. Don't try to bump the weight up again. Like, you have to be, it has to be some controlled insanity. I think, what did I call it in the Rustproofing the Iron Warrior, or something like selective idiocy, I think is the term that I use. So you need to pick those days and those sets when you really can like go into full idiot mode, and when it makes sense to do that. But you can't do that when you were truly a 25-year-old idiot in the same way now when you're 45 or 55. But you can do those occasionally and still get a stimulus. And the thing you have to recognize too is your recovery is not gonna get better in large part the older you get. It's going to be impacted.
Oh, it's a losing battle that way.
Yeah, right. And it's always a matter of balancing the stimulus with the recovery. Otherwise, you don't end up ahead of the game by the time you over work out in months and months and years. So you have to be even more careful in terms of longevity in picking those. But yeah, the microloading thing is, I tell people, like, sometimes you go to the hardware store and get magnets and use big washers. There's all sorts of things you can get, literally we're talking just ounces. Those plate mates are kind of pricey.
Yeah, they're a little expensive, but it's a great idea, but a little expensive.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I said, I just have a philosophy that says, look, you need to understand what you require as a stimulus, as a genetically unique individual. And if 6 sets or X amount of weight, whatever training methodology you prefer, because I'm a big believer in personal preference, as opposed dogma, following dogma just because. But
yes.
I just believe you should do the minimum amount of intensity and the minimum amount of volume that allows you to realize your goals, whatever that means, right? And then be mindful of the fact that anything that you do after that does have the potential repercussion down the track to say, you know what, maybe I wish I didn't spend 2 hours in the gym, in every hour when I was in my 30s, because now I'm kind of feeling it, do you know what I mean? So again, it's just not something that I hear spoken about that says, look, minimum. It's always like, everyone's pursuing optimal, everyone's trying to, get the absolute maximum, but at sometimes it's at what cost. Like I related to you originally when we started this call, I said, like, as a natural, the first year was fabulous. I had a great first year right out the gate, basically. And then the next year was not so good, and the next year was not so good. And after 4 or 5 years, you get to the point where you just you might make 1 pound progress. So if you think about the amount of punishment you have to put your body through for that 1 pound progress, it's a lot of stress. It's a lot of strain for a 1 pound gain. That 1 pound gain might not even be worth it if you think about it, because you're kind of going, well, if I was to not get the 1 pound, but I get 5 years additional training because I just pulled my head in at that point in time, it's kind of like the old adage of the man that starts a business to support his family and works 100 hours a week and loses his family.
Right.
It's like you could have worked for 60 hours a week and had everything. But you went too far and you lost everything. It's like that.
Shot himself in the foot.
Yeah, well, if you know you're only going to put on a pound of muscle as a natural, why would you push so hard? It's a very small return for a tremendous amount of stress on the human body. Like, wouldn't it make more sense to not take that pound of tissue and live forever, if that makes sense?
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And the thing is, too, that I think this may be a way to phrase it that will really people will really be able to grab a hold of, is like you have that law of diminishing returns.
Correct.
So, you get 10 pounds, 15 pounds the first year, and then it's 5, and then it's 4, and then it's 2, and then maybe it's 1. And in order to get anything beyond that, there has to be if you do too much, then the stimulus in terms of the inroads to recovery is excessive.
It's huge.
So you're threading a needle there to try to get the correct amount of stimulus and training, just purely to make those gains, not to mention the long-term effects it can have, which could take, if you're looking at maybe 5 pounds in 5 years, doing too much would be shooting yourself in the foot and that you're not recovering properly. So you're not getting that pound or 2 each year. And it could come back to haunt you in that maybe 3 years from then, if you're trying to, let's say, squat, because squats are the best thing for legs, how Tom Platt's got his legs, for instance. And the squats are destroying your hips, destroying your knees. They just don't work for you to bring your physique up the way you want to. Or maybe they do work, but they're destroying your knees and your hips. You won't be able to squat in 3 years. You will have lost that potential tool for bringing up your legs that worked for you once, because you overused it. Like, you basically pounded the hammer so much that the hammer is no longer available to you.
And this is my entire point. Like I'm saying, if you said, so the first 4 years of natural training, you would expect a decent return.
Ideally, yeah.
After that, okay, let's say we then move on to enhanced training and we get another 3 good years. So that's 7 years of progress. Once you get to that point, like I have this mindset, now we're going to train a completely different way. We effectively going to train to maintain and train for 20 years of progress, rather than throwing ourselves against that iron for a very small return, small return, but a great stress on the body. And again, I just don't hear these messages being put out there saying, look, you kind of have to do this for 3 years. Your fingers need to bleed to play the guitar.
Right.
But at some point, you could just back right off. You could do half of that volume and half of that intensity and train for 30 minutes, and that tissue's not going anywhere.
Right.
But people don't talk about that, and people don't train that way. they push, and you go, yeah, but what did you really gain in the last year? You gained 2 pounds of tissue for this cost.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to, yes, sorry, go.
I was going to say one thing that, especially in the mindset of someone who's wanting to get to basically reach their maximum genetic potential.
That's different. That's the guy I'm talking about, the professional athlete. That's a completely
right.
Different
But even those folks who may have competed before, the one thing that's interesting, and I've noticed this in myself, and I have to be careful, is that my mind is much stronger than my body is, so to speak, at least in this context. I'm not saying like, I've got this penultimate willpower, but when you diet down for shows and you're starting, you can actually literally start looking better and better just because you're getting leaner. And you have, like, if you've been competing for decades or you've done 10, 15, 20, 30 shows, you begin to associate the grind of a pre-contest with what has to be done.
What has to be done.
And in the off season, ideally you feel great. You feel rested, you feel recovered, your workouts you're stringing together really good workouts one after the other. And so then the tendency is like, if I just push a little bit harder, do a little bit more, maybe I'll get a little bit more in return. And you can get very used to, from having done all those pre-contest periods, feeling not really well recovered, because you're not. You're just having to keep the muscle mass. You have to do some semblance of what you've been doing and deal with the diet. And you get used to feeling that way, and that's not really how you should be when you're trying to make progress. If you're still trying to do that, if you're fully recovered, you should feel ideally pretty good. And eventually, like, I've done so many shows, like I just totally turn off that idea of like, I don't feel very good. Like, it's like, so what? It's just food. It's just hunger. It's just whatever. It's just fatigue. It doesn't matter. Yep. And that's a psychological phenomenon I've been trained into myself. It's just like, I don't care. Like, you ever seen the honey badger? The honey badger, like, I'm the honey badger. I don't care, whatever. I'll just do whatever I want. You can't take that into an off season. You have to completely switch your mindset. And if you can do that, then you'll recognize, this is too much. I'm always sore when I go in the gym. I'm having to like really like turn on like this mentality to go get through these training sessions. That's not where you want to be. So you can end up creating so much mental strength misapplied in the off season that you defeat yourself in terms of making progress. You should feel really good during those periods, not the way you do 4 weeks out from a show.
So one last point, and then we'll wrap it up, because I literally have taken more time than I expected. This leads me to a final recommendation I would have for guys that have been doing this for 10 years plus, and they're saying, you know what, I really don't need to be 20 pounds bigger than I am, but I still would like to get better. I'm still driven by the desire to improve.
Right.
And again, I like to say, well, even if you had a training model in place that said, look, I only really push, in one training session a month. So I have lots of recovery and I'm well rested and my joints are in place, but once a month I push. That stimulus is enough, if it's done correctly with good nutrition and good enhancement practices and good stress management and good sleep, to move forward incrementally. It may be quite a small degree, but I would argue that that's probably a very sustainable way to take on the next 20 years after the first 10. Where you go, look, I'm not pushing every week, because that leads potentially to breakdown. I'm taking good care of myself, and I'm making sure I'm completely recovered from the process, over-recovered. This would be the least efficient way to grow when you're starting out. You're going to go, you're going to grow. It's going to take you fucking forever, dude. You have to push up. But when you get to a certain point and you realize that there's a law of diminishing returns here, but I'm still motivated to grow, I don't want to push at the rate that I pushed in my early years, because I simply will eventually come unstuck. I am at 34 years training. I have never sustained an injury that has stopped me training, not one. There is no exercise that I cannot do after 34 years. I don't have any health issues from enhancement practices, and I truly believe part of it is because I got to the point where I went, you know what, I'm never going to be good enough to be, I just don't have the genetics. I don't have the frame to be an IFBB professional. I want to be the best version of me, So I will then limit my behaviors and my practices to enough that I move forward at a rate fast enough to continue to motivate me, and fast enough that people go, you're getting better, you know?
Right.
And each year when I get on the stage, I'm a little better. But the way I do it is say, look, I don't need to train that way every single week. I need to train that way enough so that I'm fully recovered, enough that I'm not pushing my tendons and joints and knees and shoulders and everything. But if you do it once a week, at some point, you still move forward, but you potentially get to this point where you go, I don't carry any injuries. I can do everything there is. And I hope to be doing this for the next 30 years, like until I'm 80 years old. But I believe if I push constantly, if I raise the drugs up to these levels constantly, that limits my longevity by definition. It's going to pull me down. So it's just for some thought for guys out there that have been doing it for 10 years and they're saying, with you, Victor, I want to keep what I've got. I want to move forward incrementally. I realize I don't, necessarily need to put on another 20 pounds of tissue. If I put on 5 in the next 5 years, I'll probably be happy with that. But how do I do that? My recommendation is Supernatural Man for enhancement. Yeah.
Right.
And my recommendation is some sort of model that includes, micro adjustments and maybe one hard training session a month per body part, not one hard session a week. Now that's completely counter to what everyone says. But if you were someone starting out and you just did one hard session a month, you would see some progress. Some. Not the same amount that you would do for, but it's probably a good strategy for guys like me that are saying, I'm in good shape, I don't have any injuries, I don't have great ambitions in front of me, but I do want to move forward, and I need to hold myself together for the next 2 decades. How do I do that? Right? So anyway.
Yeah, I think, the very important part that you said about that approach is that you recognize you're not going to be an IFBB pro. Like you know that those ideas are not like you let go of those.
I let go. It's going after the first 3 years.
Right. Yeah. I mean, me too. I mean, I trained with Dave Henry for like 8 years, and I got to see there's just no way. Like,
not going to happen.
Yeah, not going to happen. So, but the thing is, if you can be reasonable with yourself and come to grips with that idea, it's sometimes I think people unconsciously are juggling in their mind. If I just keep pushing harder and harder, I'm going to be this thing that if I ask my logical brain, there's just no way it's going to happen. But they're still holding out hope.
Yeah.
And that hope is what gets them to do things that don't behoove them for the long haul.
Yep.
And what you're talking about is like, I'm reasonable for myself. I want to look really, really good and progress just a little bit for the next 20 years, as opposed to holding on to this pipe dream for whatever reason, because maybe it was in my head and I had, Rich Gaspari on my wall when I was a kid growing up or whatever. It's not going to be me. So you let go of that, be reasonable. It's kind of like, as a friend of mine used to say, it's grow up time.
Yeah, it's time to face reality. If you've been, believe me, I am not for 1 second saying, year one out the gate, this is the model. I'm saying if you've been doing this 10 years,
right,
and you've been doing everything right, eating, sleeping, stress management, the whole 9 yards, and you've got to a certain point, it's time for a reality check and say, look, okay, so you have 2 choices: either you pull your head in and enjoy the journey for the next 20 years ahead,
yes.
Or you kind of continue to push on with an understanding that most professional guys have a career of 10 years and then they retire.
Yeah.
And what you're doing right now, the way you're training right now, the way you're eating right now, the drugs you're taking right now, that's got a due date attached to it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, hopefully not with a tag on your toe.
Correct. And if you're not getting the return after 10 years, it's like, just pull your head in and enjoy the journey for the next 20 years and be the best version of you, rather than, well, Ronnie does this and Dorian does this and, such and such did this. I'm going to adopt these behaviors and I'm just going to throw myself against them until I break.
Right. Yeah. So fall in love. The phrase that I think is often attributed to Friedrich Nietzsche is amor fati, which means love your fate. Whatever it may be. And this is something I've got it written on my walls. It's something that I remind myself of, is that this is where you are. This is the reality of things. Fall in love with that as opposed to having that constant tension of wanting the things to be other than what they are. That just creates struggle and suffering unnecessarily. So love what you have and then make the most of it.
Embrace it.
And you'll be a happy bodybuilder. Embrace it. Literally, amor fati. Love your fate.
Yep, absolutely. That's awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on as always, guys. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I do hope one day we will get together face to face, but for now, it's always good to talk to you on a call, buddy. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Can you just tell everyone before we go where they can get in touch with you if they're interested in consulting or want to learn about? I mean, you've got some fabulous resources that people can purchase. Be your own bodybuilding coach. Just give us a bit of a rundown on that for us, mate.
Yeah, well, it's drscottstevenson.com. If you just type in Scott Stevenson with a V, S-O-N, bodybuilding, you'll find me. The Fortitude Training is the book. This is the question I get asked the most. Fortitude Training is my training system. There's some dietary information in there as well. And then the Brain Dump is Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach, which is sort of everything bodybuilding, from posing to supplementation to diet to general training recommendation, but there's no training program in there. That's the Fortitude Training. So that's available on Amazon. That's where if you want a hardcover. If you want to buy the PDF, get it from my website. There's plenty of people that have pirated it. Don't finance the pirates.
Do the right thing, guys.
Yes, yeah. And if you buy the Fortitude Training, I have a discussion board where I answer questions daily for free, and I've been doing that for years to make sure people are on the right page and know what they're doing. So
that's great. Thank you so much. I was just going to ask you, you mentioned a couple of studies there that I'm unfamiliar with. If you could send them through to me, and then I'll make sure they're attached somehow to this presentation, so anyone that's interested can perhaps pull on those threads as well. That would be awesome. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll do that for sure.
All right. I'll talk to you next time. Thank you very much.
All right, man. Yeah,
okay,
sleep well.